We've all been seeing, hearing, and reading a lot of campaign free speech these last few weeks, and we know it costs money. Now, while New Mexico is not seeing the level of spending as some other states this cycle, big money is being spent. Producer Floyd Vasquez has another segment on campaign ad spending. Now, with the new dark money organizations, we don't know where a lot of the money is coming from, but we do know where it's going to: local television stations. New Mexico in Focus asks if the money impacts coverage of the candidates.
Joining us today for this campaign finance segment are Trip Jennings, Executive Director, New Mexico In Depth, online at nmindepth.com. Tim Krebs, Professor of Political Science at the University of New Mexico. Justin Horwath, Staff Writer, Santa Fe Reporter, online at sfreporter.com. And longtime state legislator, House Majority Leader Rick Mieta. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you for having us.
So let's start with the latest information on campaign spending. Trip, your New Mexico In Depth has been running a series of stories revealing how much political ad spending there's been. What's the latest?
Well, the total of how much money has been spent on commercial TV stations is right around a little under $11.4 million as of Friday, October 24th. That's a pretty large number, but we also have breakdowns by station, if you'd like to talk about that.
Absolutely, and I did ask you to break out the spending per station, and that's because with all of the coverage that we see about how much money have the candidates raised, and there is a follow the money narrative that goes along with that, but we really never talk about where that money goes to. So yes, by all means, tell us how much has been spent at KOAT Action 7 News, KOB Eyewitness News 4, and KRQE News 13.
I'm going to break it down by, this is the gubernatorial race here, we're going to break it down by candidate. Governor Martinez has spent $875,000 at KOAT up to Friday, October 24th. $792,000 at KOB, and $864,000 at KRQE. Now, if I look at Gary King's totals per station, and this is for the general election, it is right around $196,000 at KOAT. It's $109,000 at KOB, and $149,800 at KRQE. And you can see the gap in the spending between the two candidates there.
That's huge. Now, does the ad spending impact political coverage at these news organizations? Very good question, well beyond the scope of this news segment. But we can scratch the surface. And Justin, last week you reported on a new development on a story that we've all been reading about. It arises from the governor's last campaign for governor, and there was the allegation that she used a law enforcement database that was accessible in the 3rd Judicial District Attorney's Office to track political opponents. So tell us about your story and the governor's office response to it.
Well, yeah, basically, I guess the story was about Governor Susana Martinez basically using her 3rd Judicial District Attorney's Office as an extension of her 2010 gubernatorial campaign. Specifically, we have a campaign staffer from 2010 on record alleging that the governor had ordered her to send a photo of a license plate of a vehicle to an investigator in that office so that that investigator could look up the registered owner of the vehicle, basically.
Okay, now, and that would be, if that was true, that would not be lawful, or presumably that would violate some regulations.
Well, yeah, I mean, you and I, we can't track the registered owner of a vehicle using just a license plate number. That is specifically prohibited by federal law just to prevent crimes like stalking and stuff like that. We can't do that unless we have access to confidential information in motor vehicle department databases or law enforcement databases.
And what value would there be in looking up, to get information like this?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, a lot of people are kind of saying that, specifically in this instance, the vehicle had a anti-Susana Martinez bumper sticker. And the vehicle was parked at a hotel where some campaign staffers were staying. This was pretty late in the campaign, and I think by then Susana Martinez had been kind of used to trackers following her around, or the opposition following her around, and maybe that's a way to gain information on whether that person is a tracker or that person is a part of the opposition.
Okay. Now, and we've looked at emails that are part of this story, some that were released in the DA's report on the matter, some released by this left-leaning political organization, Progress Now New Mexico, and they do appear to show that that they were using, in fact, doing as is alleged by the person who is in your story. And you would think that that probably would be a story. Now, I did ask you to take a look and see if some of the local television stations are covering this. What did you find?
Well, I've found a lack of coverage, to be frank. I mean, I think the International Business Times might have picked up the story, and then the Santa Fe New Mexican had picked it up. And, you know, to the extent that the governor's office responded, they really didn't directly address the allegation being made in the story specifically. But since then, there's been kind of a lack of coverage on this issue.
Okay, and then briefly, Tripp, you've been in news for a long time. Something like this, it is the eve of the election, but if you have what appears to be proof of something of this nature, do you think that's a story?
You know, sometimes what happens and I've worked at newspapers, what happens is that there's a kind of a blackout period, like a few days before the election, where you don't run new allegations. But Justin's story, in my experience, kind of preceded that blackout period. I wonder if I looked at some of the stations too, and I followed other media outlets to track where this story and other stories, frankly. I mean, just the lack of debate about issues. I was looking at TV stations and others, serious issues. And as far as Justin's story, I didn't see much pickup, and I don't know what the thinking is. It may be that some folks are saying we need to talk to the person ourselves. I don't know. I don't know.
Okay. Yeah, and I want to jump in there and add that this has been a story that myself and I know that other reporters at other news outlets have been following for over a year. We've been kind of been denied records, been lied to, and been kind of stopped at every turn from investigating this story. And I think that it's a very difficult investigatory process, and also to get somebody to actually go on record about this story. That's very hard for, I think, a lot of folks, especially given the kind of current political climate right now.
Okay. Now, Professor Krebs, you teach courses in American politics with a specialization in urban politics, public policies, and campaigns and elections. Has the emergence of big money and the apparent somewhat docile coverage that local television stations are providing, has that changed what you're teaching in class?
Well, you know, when I talk about money in politics with my students, you know, I talk about it as you know, a sort of a necessary but not sufficient condition for winning elections. And I talk about it in terms of money in politics being primarily a reflection of competitiveness in elections. And so, you know, money tends to flow into competitive contests. Contests that are competitive get more news coverage than contests are not, that are not competitive. And so when I talk about money in politics, it's more from the standpoint of, you know, people have a right to make contributions. It's a form of political participation. Again, money tends to flow into competitive contests. Competitiveness is a great thing. It's essential to our democracy. And in terms of the media coverage, I basically we talk in terms of the press, the broadcast media, the cable stations. They're going to focus on the competitive contests because that's where the news stories are.
Okay, so do you find that with the Citizens United decision and just the rapid increase in spending that we're seeing, is that a fundamental change or just evolution?
The fact of the matter is we don't know yet. The Citizens United case was too recent. Political science in particular tends to move fairly slowly. Scholars tend to move a bit more slowly than journalists and so forth in terms of how we think about things. There have been some initial studies that have been done on this that seem to suggest that the impact of Citizens United isn't as great as some of the folks were predicting. There's a lot that we don't know, though, in terms of money in politics. In part, that's a function of the state of the law with respect to the identity of donors. to particular independent expenditure groups and these organizations. There's some research that suggests that corporate money is not being spent for direct sort of express advocacy, but we don't know what the behavior of individual CEOs is with regards to some of these independent expenditure groups, the ones especially that don't have to report, the social welfare organizations in effect, that don't have to report their donors. So there's a lot that we don't know in terms of the role of money in politics in this new era. And from the standpoint of democracy, the concern is to what extent does the influence or the interests of billionaire contributors, to what extent does that influence our policy agendas in ways that don't serve the public?
Now, Representative Mieta, you have been a citizen legislator for 24 years, representing District 11 in the State House of Representatives. How has campaign spending impacted the role of citizen legislators?
I think you've hit the nail on the head. We're a citizen legislator. This is an unpaid position in the state of New Mexico, and so therefore you're not running for a job, as most people wouldn't believe that, but that the truth of the matter is, as a legislator, we're not. And it has a huge impact because of the fact that I think as legislators we're expected to, I think our constituents expect us to knock on that door and have an interaction one-to-one with those individuals. They do in my district, and I've always lived up to that, and I think many try to. But in this new world of more money, how much time are we spending at rallies trying to generate some money to offset what the contributors given to the opposition, and how much time are we spending out there pounding the pavement and knocking on the doors? That has a significant change on not only the election itself, but I think, and this is just my thoughts, I think in due time it's going to change who that person is and how they react to their constituents, and can they, because of the fact that they're having to chase the funds, and the funding has gone from where I started. I ran my first campaign for about $5,000, and that was the end of it. But it was a lot of little cards and a lot of door knocking. You don't do that now. Now you got to get on radio and television, then you got to counteract what the other person has to say. And let me tell you, that can get really expensive. And the bottom line is, who's defining who? And that's the bottom line. They're defining who you are, and you're having to come back and say, this is who I am. But you should be doing it at the door, not necessarily on the airwaves, in my opinion.
Oh, well, absolutely. And, that's all we have time for, but we are going to continue this conversation online and in New Mexico in Focus Web Extra. Thank you very much for being here.